Good afternoon and welcome to today's Info Security Magazine webinar. My name is Dan Raywood, I'm the editor of Info Security Magazine and I'll be moderating today's event in association with LogRhythm. So for the next hour we're going to be looking at discover hidden threats with User Behaviour Analytics, UBA. We're going to be the theme of today, and we're going to be joined very soon by our speaker today, Tom Salmon from LogRhythm. But before I introduce you to Tom and our other speaker today, just a few housekeeping points from me. We will have some polls running throughout the hour, so please do join in with those as and when they appear. Also use the questions option. Let us know, what you think of what's being said, everything you want to ask Tom or our other speaker today, or me, if you really wish. And if you do have any questions specifically for a certain speaker, do put the name of that person in. Obviously, identify yourself if you choose. If you're on Twitter, where, as you see on the bottom of the screen there, hashtag InfoSecWebinar, join the discussion on social media. We're at InfoSecurityMag. And also, if you are a member of ISC Squared or ISACA, you can qualify for 1 CPE credit based on a minimum attendance of 50 minutes, 50 minutes. Once you have done that, you can download your certificate from your InfoSecurity account, submit it. Any certificates will be processed overnight, made available to download tomorrow. So, without further ado, we're going to push on to introduce our speakers today. So, I'm Dan Raywood from InfoSecurity Magazine. Up first today is Tom Salmon, who's an enterprise sales engineer at LogRhythm. And later on we'll be talking to CISO Amar Singh, who's also founder of the Cyber Management Alliance and Give Zero One Day. So we'll be talking with both those about the UBA space. But before we push over to Tom, we are going to start our first poll vote. What is the biggest cyber risk to your business? Or cybersecurity risk to your business, pardon me. So is it BYOD, that's been kicking around for a few years, cloud computing, internal threats, you determine what those internal threats are, I guess insider threat as well, supply chain risk, so the external threat, or ransomware, that's a hot topic, isn't it? So do let us know. We're going to keep this poll open through the duration of Tom's presentation, and we'll be visiting those results later on. But for the moment, I'm going to hand over to Tom Salmon from LogRhythm. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So, yeah, my name's Tom Salmon. I'm an enterprise sales engineer here with LogRhythm, and I'm here to talk to you today about user behavior analytics. So the big question today is, do you really know your users? Do you really understand what they do, where they go, what they're up to, and if everything they do can be really trusted day to day for every single operation that they're up to? Specifically, I'm going to talk about how user behavior analytics can help you to detect user threats. What we're trying to identify here is when users are doing things outside what you'd expect. Users are undoubtedly the corner of any organization, and they need to be relied upon and trusted. But you need to make sure that when things change and when a user decides to do something nefarious, you can pick that out. And we'll talk about 3 main areas today. So the first thing I'd like to start talking about is actually set the scene with what we mean when we're discussing user behavior analytics. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get a bit of data on what your users are doing to try and understand from a technology perspective, what is it they're up to? So for us, that means logs, good logging telling you everything that's happening out there in the world for your users. Typically, this will come from centralized authentication. So something like Active Directory will give us a great system of records saying when are your users logging in, when are they changing their passwords and updating their accounts, and also when are those user accounts updated. If someone, as an administrator, changes someone else's details, that's an important consideration. Secondly, it's understanding where do those users access. So when a user is authenticated, are they logging into their local machine? Are they accessing a remote server somewhere else? Or are they connecting to a VPN from some country that you trust or maybe don't trust? And then thirdly, is what do the users do with those credentials and with that access? What are they authorized to do? Say they're using some kind of file system and accessing the shares. They're going to access lots of files. So you need a good audit record showing when are people changing things? What are they viewing? If they're using web applications, what kind of actions are they performing on what kind of data? And really, that's the baseline amount of data that you could possibly need to start on the journey of user behavior analytics. Trying to understand an insight into human behavior, you need a large amount of data to do that. So first of all, we're going to think about traditional analytics. When I say traditional analytics, I'm thinking about simple rule engines that you're probably commonly used to. This would be where you build a rule that says if someone gets their password wrong 10 times, then that's bad. And we want an alarm about that because we believe this user is trying to hack into something. It's very simple. But the problem is, well, okay, every now and then a user password will expire. But then their phone, guess what, is logging into your emails every single minute trying to update them. And you're seeing loads of failed logons from this user, whether they're actively doing it or not. And it can be quite tricky to differentiate between those kinds of activity. So suddenly that'll start firing up. And you might get a few hundred or 1,000 alarms for one user for something that isn't true. So these simple rules look for simple pieces of behavior that really aren't tied to a single person. They're really just noise quite a lot of the time. And the challenge people will tell you about is false positives. They'll get hundreds, thousands of alarms that don't really tell you about risk. They just tell you something has happened a lot of times. It's not really what we're talking about today. We're really focusing on the behavior of users and what they're doing. So to give you a bit of insight into this, or thinking about analytics, what we're talking about here is learning behavior of what a user normally does. Where do they go? What do they access? How often do they do it? And with what severity and intent do they do that? Another key concept to understand is identity. If I think about myself inside LogRhythm, I have a few accounts to access systems and services. I have an email address, I have a username, I have other usernames for other systems. They're all different credentials, but actually, as an identity, there's only one, and that's myself. So it's really important that something can differentiate between when I use account 1 or account 2, they all relate back to that central concept. With simple rule-based systems, you might get one alarm for user T Salmon and a second alarm for Tom.Salmon, even though it's exactly the same person. Commonly, people have used identity and access management, IAM type systems, to help them with the concept of tying all these different logs and systems back to the concept of identity for one particular user. So the three main areas that user behavior analytics will help you identify are insider threats, account takeover, and privileged account abuse. Insider threat is looking at your trusted users and trying to understand what are they doing day to day. And it's trying to preempt before data is stolen or before a service is disrupted or fraud occurs, looking at those patterns of behavior that change and seeing when that trust model is broken from the inside. The second is account takeover. Account takeover is when you don't realize that someone else is using your identity on your behalf. Commonly, this is having your password stolen and someone logging into your emails or logging into a system and doing something purporting to be you, but actually just using your details to look like you're doing it. Your account has been stolen. And then privileged account abuse is where someone with the keys to the kingdom is doing something outside of the remit of what they should reliably be doing. As a simple example, if you think of an administrator of a network, through doing their job, they have to have access to all the routers and all the switches and firewalls, and they have to be able to update them because that's what they have to do. But reasonably, they shouldn't go to all those systems and lock every single user out of all the critical business applications they should use. That's just not a reasonable way to work. So you need to try and determine what is that reasonable, normal threshold for each person. And it will be different for every person. Administrator 1 doesn't necessarily do exactly the same thing that Administrator 2 does. So you need some kind of system that can identify what is that pattern of activity of those different people, when does it change, and when does it become interesting. So the reason that we do all this is really simple. It's to reduce risk. We want to stop your company from losing money. We want to make sure you're not losing reputation focusing on detecting risk. There's two really key metrics that you can judge your organization's security posture on, and that is your mean time to detect and your mean time to respond. Very simply, if you detect threats more quickly, you can then respond to them more quickly, and you can mitigate the damage that might occur later on. If you don't have any kind of user behavior analytics solution in place, you could reasonably say that your time to detect UBA-style threats is months or greater. Typically, the way that you detect them is after something goes wrong. It might be when you see something on the front page of a newspaper about your company, or you see a competitor is suddenly selling exactly the same product as you and somehow got hold of your intellectual property. You only find out months or years later when that occurred. As you mature through your security journey, you want to try and reduce that down to hours, minutes, and seconds so that you can be in a secure position. Security isn't a static item. IT changes every day. Undoubtedly, you're provisioning new servers, you're reviewing a cloud service, or you're updating user access. So this concept of risk is not static, which is why your security journey needs to take into account how can you detect these threats across your entire surface of IT and across all the activity that your users are doing across the network, across endpoints, and across the users themselves. The second metric is mean time to respond. It's all well and good having a solution that tells you, yeah, this user is about to steal loads of data from you. How you respond is actually what really affects your risk rating here. And there's two items. Firstly, is having the technical capacity to actually respond to that threat. Commonly, we think of this relating to automation and good tool sets. If you've got a system that can take automated actions for you when it detects a very high-risk event, that can reduce your mean time to respond to essentially nothing. A great example is, say, 11 p.m. on a Friday night, a system for UBA detects that actually we've seen this user looks like they're going to steal loads of sensitive data. Do you, A, let it happen, wait for that alarm to come through, and then when your IT team comes back on Monday morning, they review the logs and find out what data was stolen over the weekend? Or do you, B, provide the tool set so that it can take an automated defense, and it could just temporarily disable that user account and then send an SMS or a page to a high-level member of the IT team asking them for a quicker review to find out what happened? Another item that's often underlooked in mean time to respond is how well prepared are your IT team to respond to this security incident in terms of processes. A great example I always give is you think of a car, a Formula One car going into a pit lane. It takes about 3 seconds between that Formula One car driving in, having all the tyres changed, all the wheels taken off, completely refueled, and the driver's visor being cleaned, and it's out the other side. The reason they can do it so quickly is because all day long, everyone knows exactly what their job is, and they continually train, prepare, and feedback their lessons learned of what happened. That guy knows, I am changing bolt number 1, I'm going to move to the left, and guy number 2 is going to come in and put a new one on. Everyone knows their job. That's exactly the same thing here. When something occurs, you need to know how to respond, have the tools in place to respond to it, and people need to know at what point do we escalate this to the IT director, to the CEO? When do we call the PR company? So, moving on to our examples we talked about. So number 1 was inside a threat. The scenario for inside a threat is very simple. Employees are your greatest asset. No company is valuable because it has a great solution or a great piece of technology. It's valuable because of the people that are out there and inside your company, helping to market it, sell it, deliver those solutions and services and interact with your customers. That is the value of any organization. So employees need to be valued. But in the process, when they're valued, you also have to trust them to do their job, which means giving them access to tools, information, and data that is often sensitive and is often commercially confidential and sensitive that would allow someone to build a competitor or sell it to someone else. And it's this exact reason that insider threats are hard to detect and can be the most damaging, because humans are fairly unpredictable. They don't necessarily do the same thing every day, and one person could easily take away your crown jewels and pass it somewhere else. So I'd like to give you a real-life example of an insider threat of what happened. And I'll show you exactly from a technical perspective where we could have seen this and how we could have stopped it occurring and getting worse. So in this example, it was a law firm. A group of lawyers were leaving a current law firm to join a rival. What they wanted to do was take information with them. And lawyers are funny creatures. They have this feeling that when they create a document or a template or a really great contract, because they put their intellectual sweat into it, it somehow becomes theirs and they own it in some way. So instead of having to start doing it again, well, they could just take a bit of creative influence from that template and take it to another company, save them some time. And also, where one law firm is working on a particularly sensitive matter or a particular case, if you can take that information somewhere else, that's worth quite a lot from a commercial perspective of jobs you can work on. So what these lawyers did was they took the data with them by uploading it to Dropbox. And secondly, they actually manipulated and sabotaged the existing data to make some of it invalid and some of it irrecoverable so that the current law firm couldn't continue to operate with those customers, which meant the customers at law firm A stopped working with them because they didn't trust them, they lost their reputation, and they moved on to where these new lawyers were going. So if you saw this from a technical perspective, there's three main areas where LogRhythm could have actually stopped this from happening. There's a very consistent, repeatable, and dependable attack chain in any attack, technical or non-sophisticated, and very specifically with user behavior analytics. You don't start with losing data. You start with reconnaissance and planning and understanding the intent of what's going to happen. In this case, what the lawyers wanted to do was they actually wanted to understand what is out there that's commercially sensitive. Which matters and subjects and clients are we working with right now that are worth a lot of money to someone else? You need to identify the target and understand its value. You're almost doing a business impact analysis of that data. But in the process, what they did was left behind a fantastic audit trail. If it was being mined, it would have been fairly obvious that on an average day, if you looked at the profile of those lawyers that left, they might have worked on a handful of cases. But then suddenly what they're doing is they're clicking through hundreds and thousands of documents and matters and cases to try and understand what's the most valuable. What do we want to take with us? And also at the same time what they're doing is they're leaving behind an audit trail of things they shouldn't be able to access. Any good document management system, any good file system will have permissions in place of things that you can't access. And everyone knows you click on it and it says, sorry, you cannot come in here. Very simply, just build a baseline around how many times a day is someone not allowed to access something. That clipping level is a few at best. If it suddenly ticks up and becomes pretty significant and increases at a high rate, along with accessing lots of documents that have never been looked at before, that's really abnormal. And they could have stopped it at that point if they were monitoring that automatically. Further down the attack chain, they then moved on to the very sensitive documents. They focused on the most valuable and commercially sensitive data. And again, that's where you can start to focus your intent and focus your activity around watch lists. What is the value to your business? What's the risk of losing this data? If you can build that into the algorithms that are protecting it, then you can get risk-based alerting to say, right, well, actually, yeah, we kind of care they're accessing lots of different matters that needs to be reviewed, but suddenly they're really trying to access anything related to this very strictly confidential system that's more important to us right now. This needs quicker escalation. We need to start our processes more quickly. And then finally, the last step is actually the data exfiltration piece. In this case, Dropbox was used, and it was around 80,000 documents. So you can tie together two really simple events. One, I've seen someone copy 78,000 files to their laptop. Two, I've seen someone upload 78,000 files to Dropbox.com. Or I've just seen someone upload 5 gigabytes of data to Dropbox.com by monitoring my network traffic. Those two things together are fairly abnormal in terms of behavior. And you can tie those together to get a fairly reasonable overview of someone doing something they really shouldn't do. So the second item I wanted to talk to you about is account takeover. So when we look at the data and statistics, 80% of attacks resulting in data breach, so that successfully occur and actually lose data, come from an external attacker. The biggest question that people struggle with is if it's legitimate access, the username's right, the password is right, the activity is within the permissions that someone's given, how do we know if it's being done by user A, who it actually is, or some nefarious actor pretending to be you? How do you get non-repudiation in this case? So for this example, I want to talk about Anthem Blue Cross. For those of you that don't know, they're a very significant healthcare provider. 1 in 9 Americans had health insurance provided by Anthem Blue Cross. In this case, the attack was actually really simple. It's something people see every single day, spear phishing. What happened was there was a very sophisticated, very targeted spear phishing campaign against the database administrators inside Anthem Blue Cross. And what happened was that one of them fell for it. It's very simple. If you send out hundreds and thousands of spear phishing emails to people, and you target them successfully, eventually someone will click on one, and you will get access to their credentials to some system. With the concept of identity, we know that actually one set of credentials isn't necessarily all of your different access to all the systems. It might only be one small portion. But that's when you start understanding the wider scope. If I can access a VPN, and I get to, say, a webmail, is there a vulnerability in the webmail server that means I could get through to a back-end server, and then pivot from there to another server? How far can I go with this one set? And then secondly, in the process, more spear phishing emails affected 5 other Anthem employees. So in total, 6 people lost their credentials to spear phishing at Anthem Blue Cross. As a result, 80 million people's personal health records were stolen. Think about that. 6 people entered their passwords in a dodgy online form. 80 million people lost their personal identity off the back of it. So, as you can see, the stakes here are pretty high. This one's a bit more technically sophisticated, so I'll take you through it one step at a time, as it was a multi-staged attack that took a little bit of time to come through. This didn't just occur in 5 seconds. This was a long, targeted process that occurred over weeks and months. Step 1, as we talked about, it was spear phishing, a targeted email campaign specifically to try and get access to credentials of privileged users. So, one of the things you can do to detect spear phishing is doing the basics well, making sure that your email scanners are on, making sure that they're blocking, making sure you're reviewing the alerts that are coming out and profiling where they come from, doing the basics well. One of the common things you find with spear phishing is people try to impersonate things as well as they can. So, for example, if you own the website Anthem.com, what I might do is I might send you an email from a domain that looks very, very similar, but I'll just switch around 2 of the letters so they look very close. And you can actually pick that out with LogRhythm, because we can actually monitor what's the domain coming from and what's the distal appropriation between those 2 words. Have the letters just been ordered around, which becomes fairly suspicious. But then what happens is that when someone tries to actually use those credentials, then the flags start coming up. So a really simple example to this is geolocation. If an administrator for the database comes to his desk every day, and for 7 years, what he does is he sits down at his desk and he administers the databases from that workstation. We know what time he logs in, we can see the kind of servers he accesses. You can build a fairly good profile of this user. But then suddenly, he starts accessing the VPN from Germany. And he's accessing the VPN from Germany at the same time that he's sat at his desk in the office. And then suddenly the VPN from Germany accesses lots of different systems at the same time. Any reasonable person could see that's different. That's abnormal activity outside of his normal behavior. Then what we saw in this particular attack was that malware was placed onto particular hosts. To get further into the network, they put known bad files and they made it start at boot time so that they could keep coming back and keep accessing systems. Then they did lateral movement. So they tried to get access to other systems in a really simple way, brute force, trying lots of different accounts, trying lots of different passwords to pivot between systems to see how far they can get. Then when they finally got to their core database servers, they started sweeping around to understand where is that key personal information database. Once you've discovered it, you've then attained your target, and you need to exfiltrate the data. Exfiltrating the data is going to be a significant amount of information and records. If you monitor how many records are pulled from the database and how many files are taken out, it's a fairly obvious amount of activity when things start to change that much. Typically, a database server will only be connected to by the business applications, and they'll do it in a very set way for a very set amount of data in a very set amount of time. At any of those points above, you could have picked out a change in activity. Maybe one on its own isn't enough to make a decision, but together, 2 or 3 should be enough to tell you this is wrong and this needs investigating. So our third and final example here is talking about privileged account abuse. When we talk about privileged accounts, we're talking about administrators, network admins, domain admins, anyone with what's called keys to the kingdom. So this means that they can do pretty much what they need to do their job, because that's what they have to do. And luckily this one's fairly easy to spot, because as long as you've got the right tools in place, as long as you're monitoring for it, not too hard to see. So our final example is a global energy company. And what happened was that one of their competitors wanted their intellectual property to understand about their processes and how they run and how they work and some of their software. So one of their lead engineers was bribed. They said, if you give us some of the source code, some of the IP, some of the documents and processes, we'll personally give you some money for it. So he logged into that access system using his developer account, copied those files out, sold them to a competitor, made himself some nice money. Because of this, the company he worked for lost their competitive advantage. They lost 3/4 of their revenue, they lost $600 million in market value, and half the workforce was laid off because there's one privileged user misusing his access that he legitimately was given access to. He was a developer, so he had to have access to development systems, but the way he interacted with them was malicious. So in this case, there was a number of steps where we could have noticed this. First of all, credential misuse. When people escalate their credentials, on Linux, that's sudo. On Windows, it's run as, or it could be logging in directly as an administrator. Then the risk level is elevated directly, because you're seeing that someone now has even more access than they had before. So the clipping threshold should be lower, and the profile should be different, because a user under their normal account is what they do day to day. Those few times when they become an administrator needs a very tight review to understand what's happening. So in this case, the developer became an administrator to access more systems and pull out more data than normal. He then started accessing lots of files and directories and pulling down large amounts of source code. To do his job, he would pull things out of source code, he would add things in, but it would be a limited amount of access. It would be a few here, a couple of hundred there. Suddenly when you start updating and pulling large volumes of data, and you don't normally do that, that becomes different. The way that they tried to hide the activity was the oldest trick in the book. Create a temporary account, log in as that user, do all your account as a fake user, and then delete the account. And then suddenly all the credentials are gone. Luckily, that's very easy to pick out, and LogRhythm's got a built-in rule specifically for that. A temporary account created, something happens, and then it's deleted, someone cleaning up their tracks. And then you see more privilege escalation and someone again accessing a high volume of sensitive data, manipulating it, pulling it out, and changing it. Should be fairly easy to spot. So one of the key things I want you to take away from this today is that malicious behavior is the intersection of multiple attributes. We can't stare at one particular dimension. It's not how many times did I get my password wrong. It's not what time did I log into my computer. It's not where did I log into or how many files did I touch. It's all of those things tied together. The wider world around it is outside of UBA, is understanding what is my network connections happening. How quick do they go? What applications are we seeing? Tying together user activity, network activity, process changes inside the endpoint, and as much context as possible gives you true holistic threat detection. Understanding where are my threats coming from and how does it impact me as a business? Will this cause us to lose value? Will we lose a competitive advantage? Okay, we need to instigate our response process much more quickly than if it was just a test environment and something changes that we don't really care about. You need to understand the context around it. This is where LogRhythm fits in. What we do is we have a unified security intelligence platform. We give you the tools and the visibility for incident response orchestration and automation. We give you access to your log data so you can see the summaries and the trends of when things change. We give you next generation analytics focused on those areas, specifically into users, mining into network, and understanding detailed endpoint analytic behavior, and then tying that back into the holistic view. As we said before, you can't tie yourself up too much on one particular trait being affected. It's the intersection of all these changes that will really tell you when risk occurs. And this is where LogRhythm fits in, is being in that overarching technology to monitor lots of different security tools and platforms and trends and tell you what's happening. So what you need to focus on for UBA, as we said, is to rapidly detect and rapidly respond to the three main areas for UBA. Insider threats. When do my users do things they don't normally do? Account takeover. Has someone stolen my credentials? Are they doing things under my account that I'm not aware of? Is someone impersonating someone else? Privileged account abuse. Is someone doing something with their high-level credentials that they shouldn't be doing? The main differentiators for LogRhythm and UBA is that we analyze multiple dimensions and multiple traits in different ways to give you unique perspective. We accelerate your time to value by integrating this data together. You're not just looking at 6 or 7 different tools and looking at many different dashboards. You're looking at one consolidated view. When LogRhythm tells you we see an insider threat, you can then review through an easy dashboard, okay, I'm looking at a user. Tell me what systems he logged into. Tell me what website he looked at. Tell me what files he's been accessing, and give me all that information summarized in one place. Don't waste your time looking at different sources and try and tie it together. When something does happen, we give you efficient workflows to respond. You can do this automatically. Smart Response by LogRhythm can take automated responses to quarantine, lock down, and isolate users and hosts. And you can build in workflows into that as well for approval. So you can say, right, we want to have an approval that the IT manager has to say, yeah, let's go and make that lockdown. And then maybe the CIO has to make that decision of do we instigate a quarantine of this subnet of the network. When you aggregate all that together, you'll be in a much better position to understand what your users are doing and become more secure. Thank you very much. I'd like to open up the floor for question and answers.
Tom, thank you very much for that presentation. Hopefully everyone was enjoying that. We are just waiting for Amar to join us still. Unfortunately, he's having some connectivity issues, but hopefully we will be hearing from him very soon to get the CISO perspective on User Behaviour Analytics. So if you have any questions, by the way, do feel free to use the questions function and any questions for Tom, and obviously we will do our best to get to those before the end of the session. What we're going to do before we move on is we're going to push to get the first poll results, I should say. So we asked you, what is the biggest cyber risk to your business? And of a total of 72 votes, 50% said internal threats. So we'll be chatting with Tom on that in just a second. 19% said BYOD, 14% ransomware. That's very interesting. Maybe you haven't been hit yet. Maybe you're determining what's been a problem rather than what could be a problem. 13% cloud computing, and then 4% supply chain risks. So, Tom, 50% say internal threats. We've done some webinars here on Info Security around insider threats. Obviously, it's a very tricky one to spot, but I guess that's where user behavior analytics come into play. Is that right? Because I noticed in your case study there about the law firm, I think it was.
Absolutely, and I think there's probably some knowledge here around the definitions. When people say inside a threat, I suspect they're probably talking about all the three things we're talking about here because, yeah, we say we're looking at account takeover and privileged account abuse. They all still come from the inside. Instead of saying, well, are we scared of the attackers from the outside world trying to hack through our firewalls and break down the doors, we're looking at people that we would traditionally trust. We'd say, well, inside the organization, I can, do what I like. To do my job, I need to make sure that I can access my databases and my applications, and if it goes wrong, I'm going to shout at IT because I should have access all day long. And you have to understand what that trade-off looks like. If you give people so much access they can do everything they want to do, it might overextend the amount of things that someone malicious could do. So really the key here is trying to profile and understand what's the difference between those groups of people. There are plenty of people who legitimately need access to lots of different systems. High-level management, they need to access HR and finance and IT and reporting and see pretty much everything inside the network. But if someone managed to steal their details and could then access all that information, that'd be pretty bad. So if we can begin to profile what that user does and just simply how often do they access those systems, where do they come from, what kind of reports do they run, we can get a bit more insight into maybe when they're starting to move off track and maybe it doesn't look like the signature of that person going on. So yeah, I'm not surprised that this is flagging up as something interesting, and hey, that's probably why they're here today.
Absolutely. Eamon's just going to join us in a second, by the way, so I'm just going to push on to the next slide and open up this second poll, which is, could you, excuse me, and click the right button, that'd be nice, wouldn't it? Could you detect and block privileged account abuse? And the options there are, yes, we monitor privileged accounts and block them on signs of misuse. No, we monitor privileged accounts but do not block. No, we do not monitor privileged accounts, or C, you don't know. Well, hopefully if you don't know, you've learned a little bit now then from Tom's talk just now. And I'm just being in touch with Amar. He's going to join us at any moment. So, yeah, one thing I just want to jump into there, Tom, before we jump into a question we just had about the LogRhythm UBA platform. In terms of ransomware, so that's obviously a very common theme now for here, and by the way, if you're interested in ransomware, look out for a webinar coming in mid-June with our deputy editor regarding ransomware for more information on that. Is that something that behaviour analytics can track that sort of detection coming in, or is it sort of slightly more of an in-depth detection than something that's coming in through the endpoint, for example?
So interestingly, we've actually seen a couple of times that User Behaviour Analytics with LogRhythm has actually identified ransomware from a file-based perspective. So if you look at any piece of ransomware, there's a common trait between them. It's very easy to get a piece of Locky or whatever it's doing and start to look at the DLLs and look at the technical signatures. But you get so far into the weeds that you're looking for hashes and things that can change very quickly. But what you realize is that for ransomware to be effective, what does it need to do? It needs to encrypt your files and deny you access to them. So what you see is that a user is on their laptop and they get ransomware. That ransomware goes to all the network drives and it starts touching all the files and it starts modifying them. So if you want to overwrite a file, it leaves behind a file access that says, I have modified this file or I've deleted this file. So very simply, a UBA style technology that's showing, well, how many files does a user modify on a daily basis? 10, 100, 150? If someone starts modifying 100,000 files in a day, and they're all being renamed to the same thing, and they're all being changed very quickly, that's pretty easy to pick up and pretty significant. So from a ransomware perspective, it's actually a fairly similar technology solution without focusing too far into the details of particular executables, and that'll help protect you against all the variants that will come out in the future as well.
Excellent. And we've had a quick question in. How protected/hardened is LogRhythm UBA? I guess it's pretty hardened, otherwise you wouldn't be selling it. I'm not quite sure what the question means there, but in terms of the overall security of the UBA, can it be penetrated by an external hacker to do a complete overhaul of access?
So the first thing to refer back to from a LogRhythm perspective is historically our roots as a company were with the US military and US federal organizations. They impose very strict standards that we had to adhere to. So things like FIPS 140 and EAL2, we've had all that common criteria of validation. One of the things that we're hot on, obviously as a logging company, is auditing everything that we do with LogRhythm. So any user that uses LogRhythm, if you search for some logs, if you change a configuration, if you create an account, we fully audit ourselves and run UBA against the activity inside LogRhythm that's happening. And then with the logs themselves, what we do is we use tamper-evident hashing. So when we receive that log from a domain controller saying that someone's logged in or changed a password, we capture it using SSL, so it's transmitted over the wire. We write it to disk, and then we give it a hash to prove that it has not been tampered with. So if there's a user internally, for example, the law firm, and you need to take them to court and prove that they have been doing that data, we can show the logs have not been tampered, they haven't been altered, and this has a digital chain of custody that cannot be refuted in court. So, yeah.
Great. Well, we're just going to let this poll run for just one more second. We're just waiting for Amar just to join in, and hopefully he will be any moment. Let's do this second poll question is regarding could you detect and block privileged account abuse. We're going to leave this running for just another minute. But you mentioned this in your presentation, and this is a very big deal to actually get people kind of to get access to systems now. Yeah, we see there was some reporting came out about credential theft and your use of stolen credentials is now more of a threat than malware. Obviously, there are some statistics out there where you can actually associate that, but in terms of actual privileged access, there's been companies out there talking about privileged access increase for quite some time. Why is this still a problem? Surely a person leaves, you just kind of unselect them on the Excel spreadsheet, or obviously it's a lot more sophisticated than that. But here in May, almost June 2016, why is something like privileged access still proving a problem for businesses?
So the challenge is people. We're incredibly hard to predict. I can go into my job every day of the week and I can work there for 15 years and I'm completely happy to be the network admin. And what I do is I add user accounts, I add firewall rules, and I just keep on churning along doing exactly the same thing. If you built a graph of my activity, you'd see that I do pretty much consistently what's happening. And then one day I decide that I don't like the company anymore and I'm leaving and I hate everyone and I really want to disrupt things. So then the challenge is, well, how do I work out when that user suddenly changes and their mindset has adjusted from I'm really happy to I'm really sad? Because I'm not going to walk in with a t-shirt saying I'm going to cause some damage today. So the only way to do that is by the activity and the audit left behind and actually the traits and signatures of what that user's doing. Rather than someone telling you their intent, you have to see it through the activity they're exhibiting.
And that's just joining the background. That's Amar Singh. Amar, how are you? You are live, by the way, so don't swear. It might have been a call, but thanks very much for joining. Amar, we're just
Hello. Yes, I'm here.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I do apologize.
No problem. We're just on privileged account abuse. We'll just wrap up in our second poll here. From the sort of, sorry to really throw you straight in the deep end as soon as you jump in, but in terms of privileged account management, from your perspective, is this still proving a challenge for businesses?
Interestingly, I just gave a very interesting talk on this yesterday to a very select group of people. And my question was, are you ready? Is the audience ready for this? WTF. Now hear me out. Don't panic. Okay? Because the question is, why the fuss? And this is what I get asked a lot of the time. Every time we engage clients, when I talk to clients, one of the first questions is, are you looking at privileged users? And the question comes back, oh, Omar, why are you so fussy about the privileged users? We have them under control. Why are you so focused on the privileged? So the reality is, most organizations still don't get it. Now, I'm going to make a bold statement here. My issue is actually a lot of IT people don't truly get privileged behavior. And that is very worrying because IT needs to understand the reality of what a privileged user can do. Only then will the business understand.
Sure. Well, we're going to just wrap up that second poll. And the question was, could you detect and block privileged account abuse? The four options were, yes, we monitor privileged accounts, but do not block them on signs of misuse, or block them on signs of misuse. And that was the top result, actually. So, yeah, of the 54 votes that were cast, yes, we monitor privileged accounts and block them on signs of misuse was 39%. 26% no, we monitor privileged accounts but do not block. 20% we do not monitor privileged accounts, and 9% don't know. Well, hopefully, in sort of when this webinar.
Dan, sorry to interrupt you, Dan. I know I'm dialed in late, so I do apologize. But one of the questions the users must ask is, are they looking at privileged users that are in the business focus? So I call them the pubs, right?
Okay.
People may be monitoring the enterprise admin, but to me, the enterprise admin is possibly the least of the headache. There are several other privileged users in both the IT domain, but also the business domain, which need to be monitored. And I think, LogRhythm mentions very clearly, and I support that, is you need to understand the behavior of these folks, right? What time does the CFO access a folder? I mean, this is a live example. I've gone to the legal counsel of a company, and the legal counsel said one thing. He wanted to know when anybody other than him accessed his folder, and that was his requirement. So he wanted a report of anyone who accessed his particular folder on the particular file share. So the question is, privileged users of business need also to have their behavior monitored to a certain extent.
Sure. Absolutely. Tom, did you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, so I completely agree with what Amar is saying, that it's almost this perspective that we see, yeah, the domain admins and the IT admins, they can delete things. But he's right. If you think of an executive in an organization, they can suddenly see reports from finance and IT and HR, and if someone had access to their account maliciously or somehow managed to steal those credentials, they could almost see significantly more than maybe an IT admin could do, because they might be able to see the systems underlying it, but a senior executive would have access to actually the company confidential data inside those systems. And as soon as someone took those credentials or tried to do something malicious, that would be interesting when someone has more keys to the kingdom than they really should.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, just before I'm actually going to run the final poll actually for today, and then we'll just come back to Emma, just so we make sure we get through everything. When a breach occurs, how long would it take your organisation to detect and respond to it? So, hours, months, years, or not confident we could at all. So, do vote in that one. That vote is now open. I've opened that, so please do vote in that. Emma, we're going to run back to you. We're going to wrap up on that vote at the end of the webinar. I just want to, in terms of UBA technology, what do you see as a good trait of UBA technology? What the functionality that would you look for when purchasing and running it?
I think granularity is really important, if I may. Once you get over the HR hurdle and the diplomatic and privacy issues, good luck with that. But once you get all of that done and dusted, right, I'm a major supporter of behavior analysis. And to me, granularity is important. And I think, LogRhythm and I are very much on the same wavelength on this, is defining normal, right? How do you define normal for a particular user? And are you able to focus in on multiple facets and context of the user? Where is he or she logging from? What are their habits? What else do they do? Can you actually put in external data that may not be part of the regular log monitoring, for example? I think being able to not only baseline but possibly dynamically understand what is happening on the behavior with users is also a very key functionality, definitely.
Great stuff. And I'm just going to counter that then with a question about what do you see as the negative traits of UBA? Is there anything that we would think, is it lack of granularity? Is it too heavy sort of monitoring of the user that it's disturbing user performance? What do you think of it, things that would make you think, I don't want that sort of functionality?
I think one of the biggest challenges, and I mentioned it earlier, the biggest headache of this particular aspect is going to be the possible abuse. Right? It's a process issue. It's also a bit of an HR issue. A company's going to be able to fire people because they've logged in from Starbucks too many times, right? I would be the first one in that line. Right? I mean, I love Starbucks, but you know what I mean. So the challenge is once all this data becomes available, what happens to that data? Is it going to be abused and for the wrong reasons by managers during appraisal? That's one of the questions I was asked by HR. And I actually did not have an answer at that time because it's a process and business question, So these considerations, in fact, the more granular the tool, the more interesting the outcome, because that data could be used for appraisal, for promotion, or for sacking someone. So that really needs to be, considered what happens to that.
One thing another thing I want to bring up before we wrap up on this webinar and also go to our questions in the third vote. Emma, we did a vote earlier on where we asked what's the biggest cybersecurity risk to your business, and 50% said internal threats. So we're going to assume most people would assume that's insider threat. Is that something that you think user behavior analytics could actually help prevent or spot?
Sorry, could you repeat that again? Sorry.
Sure. So in our first vote, 50% of the respondents said that insider threats or internal threats were the biggest threat to the business. Is that something you think that user behavior analytics could help detect and spot and essentially block that sort of instance from happening?
Ooh, that's a really interesting one. I think, first of all, 50% is possibly too low. And I'm not saying insiders are bad. I think insiders have the credentials and the access that is the biggest headache. So actually, insiders are the biggest threat, full stop, number one. But about the detection, it's really interesting because here's the challenge. And this is something maybe many people have not thought about. The new generation, the younger folks who are coming into work, they are statistically proven to be influenced by social media much more than you and I, and hopefully Tom also, I assume, right? So the ability to change people's mindset affects their motivations. So having a proper UBA to be able to detect change in motivations is a really ideal situation, because change in motivations is happening much faster in history than it has ever been, right? So once your motivation changes, your attacker, who may not have been an attacker yesterday, may be an attacker in 6 weeks from now. The question is, are you going to be able to detect that change in motivation?
Yeah, I think that's good. Tom, I don't know if you want to comment on that, in terms of updating the product and the management to contain new changes. Is that something that you're able to work with?
Yeah, Amal raises a really interesting and a very wide point there that I completely agree with, that the mindset and change of influence of people, I'm not that influenced by social media myself, but you see younger people very quickly, strongly having allegiances for ideas, suddenly running with it and very quickly wanting to do something. And this is actually something that UBA can really quickly help with, that the longer you have to build in this baseline of when someone does the same thing day in, day out, accessing those systems, using it as a normal human being, if they suddenly decide, I want to be someone I'm not, and work and act in a way that I think is different, that should be fairly easy to spot when someone that isn't perhaps so crafty or clever tries to work around the systems without paying any attention to thinking there might be something watching them as well. I think a lot of people aren't necessarily aware that technologies like UBA exist for what they're doing, And the users themselves think, yeah, I'm just going to copy out this folder. I'm just going to download all these reports and take them with me. And if they suddenly start doing that very quickly within, a day or a week, that should be quite evident compared to that normal profile of what they're doing.
Great. We just had a question in, Tom, which I think we'll go to both of you. But how long is needed to build a baseline of normal, in inverted commas, before you start calling out exceptions? So how long would that, a picture of what normal looks like, take to actually create?
So, go on, Emma, you go first.
No. I mean, I was just going to say it depends, to be totally honest. But I'll let you go first, Tom. Go on.
So I was going to say it's a graduated model, actually. It depends on what you're monitoring. If you're looking at a network-based system, usually a day is enough because network devices, they're pretty boring. They talk on a port, they send some data, they just keep doing the same thing day out, day in and day out. But then with users, there's different categories of access. So typically what you see is that, for example, the time someone logs into their computer doesn't really vary that much, and the countries they come from doesn't vary that much. But the longer running traits, for example, how many directories they access, how many reports they run on a system, will actually vary depending on their job role. So it could well take a month for someone to go through all the cycles of the things that they continually do to lock in exactly what's happening. But that doesn't mean that you can't do it in stages and actually work out the quick baseline at the start of a few days, is there a big change, but then improve and cement that change over time and get more of a picture as people start to add into it. What do you think of that, Emma?
Totally. I mean, I think it's got to be an ongoing process, number one. Number two, it really depends, like you're saying, and what depends on what data you are digesting or ingesting, rather. No, I'm hungry. Sorry. So it got to be an ongoing process. But normally, in my experience, maximum a week. And what I normally do is I sit down with the user. So it's very straightforward. If you don't mind, what are your working patterns? Do you work from Starbucks? Do you work from, do you work from China? Or what do you do? That helps just verify. Sometimes you need to verify all the data you're collecting.
Yeah. Before we wrap up then, I am just going to draw a close to that third and final vote. When a breach occurs, how long would it take your organisation to detect and respond to it? 50% said hours. This is based on 50 votes, by the way, so 25 people said hours. 28% weeks, 16% months, 6% not confident we could at all. That's not very reassuring. And 0% years. So everyone out there reading the Verizon report can see that the time to detect obviously is increasing. Amar, let's finish up with you then. 50% reckon they could detect and respond to a breach within hours. Is that possible?
I'm impressed. I would love to meet the 50%. That is pretty impressive. I just don't see that. When at my side, it's just I think that I would have probably seen 20 to 30% as being what I would have thought.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I guess it also depends what response means. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. I'm sure in this case it's actually detecting it and acknowledging it and sort of stopping it, I guess, stopping any more leaks. I suppose that's the way I respond. Paul, what about yourself? Just finish up with you then. 50% reckon they can do it within hours. Using something like UBA, is that making life easier for detection?
So I think it depends on what people consider the breach and what they're stopping. So thinking in terms of, has my malware picked something up and has my firewall blocked something? Can I respond to that? Absolutely. The challenge here is the unknown. Yeah, my users are out there doing their job. Can I really pick up slight changes in malicious activity? You're going to struggle without something looking for UBA-type activity. So I think 50%, as Amar said, is probably pretty on the high side here, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right, well, fortunately that is all the time we have today, and thanks very much to everybody for listening. Obviously, some really interesting and well thought out questions, and obviously the answers fantastic as well. So thanks to everybody who participated, and also those who participated in our polls today. We'd like to thank LogRhythm for their sponsorship of today's webinar, and obviously Tom Salmon from LogRhythm, and also Emma Singh. He was short but sweet, but it was great to have you on board once again.
I do apologize to all the viewers, yeah, but thank you for having me.
No, welcome, glad you were able to join us at last. So for details on upcoming info security webinars, see the website www.infosecurity-magazine.com. We'll actually be back next Thursday with a webinar on how the CISO can be the Department of Yes. So, hey, if you are saying you can detect, well, I hope it should be entertaining, especially if you can say, yes, we can detect, and yes, we haven't got a problem, then maybe one for you. There will be a recording of this webinar available via the Info Security website very shortly. We'd ask you before you log off to rate this webinar, tell us what you liked about it, maybe what you'd like to hear from us in future. We're always open to any suggestions of topics for future webinars. So without that, with all that done, thank you very much for attending today and for listening, and we'll see you next time.